So good afternoon or hello from wherever you are. So we're ending this very interesting journey on world order with a panel on the ends of international orders. So the purposes of orders, and we're hitting the big question of the why that WHY, the explicit big Y, but also the implicit a number of implicit little Ys, and of course vice versa. So in a way, we're getting into the beast of world order, trying to make sense of it, which is a very, at the same time nowadays, a very urgent question, but of course an incredibly contested one. And for that, we have again a great lineup of distinguished scholars. We'll have, so maybe I'll introduce one after the other before they do their presentation. So we'll have Christian Smith from the University of Queensland. Then we'll have Jennifer Welch, from McGill University, and then Matthias Spector from the Fondation Geldium Vargas. And last but not least, Professor Mike Scaler from the American University. So we'll start with Christian Smith. And as you know, he has worked on many issues of international relations, law, institutions, and then moved to culture. And as we've seen yesterday, and I think more implicitly maybe in the last panel, culture pertains to a number of questions about, when trying to reimagine a world order. And I would like to mention the fact that Chris co-authored with actually Andrew Phillips, who talked yesterday, a volume on culture and order in world politics. So some of the issues in that volume were actually tackled yesterday, as you know. But I would also recommend his book on cultural diversity, which came up a couple of years ago, that Chris authored, and which helps recasting this whole notion of culture and help, reframing this whole nexus of pluralism versus solidarism, which we've been caught in when talking about the purposes of Ends World Order. So when I asked Chris, what will be your angle, he suggests, well, what about out with pluralism and solidarism, no less. So we're in for a big reshuffle, which we actually need, I think, at this point, absolutely. And I'm expecting lots of food for thought and intellectual caffeine. So the floor is yours, Chris, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Caroline. It's now heading towards midnight here in Brisbane, so I'm probably in need of caffeine, but if I have any, I'm not going to get any sleep when I eventually get to it. But look, let me begin by saying it's wonderful to be joining the conference, and I apologise for not having been able to participate in the discussions yesterday. But it's certainly, the first session has been very stimulating. So what I wanted to do was really to take a cue from the description of this panel, which the panel itself is meant to be addressing the question of for what purposes are international orders constructed? And I'm one of those scholars who believes that, in fact, international orders evolve in two ways. One is incrementally, but also they often evolve by design. So I think it's not irrelevant to ask what purposes international orders are constructed for. And I want, that's what but I want to focus in particular on the standard or conventional framing of how we answer this question. And that's a framing that was also mentioned in the summary of this panel, which is the distinction between pluralist and solidarist international orders. And I want to really challenge that distinction. Now, everybody will know, but I'll just briefly recap that in the pluralist view, the purpose of an international order is to ensure coexistence among independent states. And this purpose is realized through a minimalist framework of norms and supporting institutions. And the core norms that we generally think about are mutual recognition of sovereignty, non-intervention, self-determination. So this is the pluralist conception of international order. And the alternative to this is a conception of a solidarist international order. And this is a more ambitious conception of the purposes of an order, where the states that are members of the order aren't just seeking coexistence, but they share certain values and goals that are more substantive and more elaborate. Now, for Grotius, who Bull thought was emblematic of this particular view, this was an agreement about what constituted just war in an international order. So this was more than coexistence, but this was agreement about some substantive values. And this purpose is realized through a thicker set of norms and more robust or more extensive or elaborate set of enabling institutions. Now, probably the best recent example of that would be norms of R2P, which Jennifer may wish to speak on or not when she discusses this, which is often treated as a sort of classic example of a sort of solidarist purpose to an international order. Now, I've long believed that this distinction between pluralism and solidarism as a framing for thinking about the purposes of international order is quite unhelpful. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the framing assumes or applies, if at all, only to orders of sovereign states. And sovereign states have been extremely rare in international history. And the world of sovereign states that we exist in now is really a post-1970s construction. And so containing this debate about purposes within the framing of pluralism and solidarism is really using a framing that sort of has hardwired into it a kind of self-limitation. And I'd like to just note on this point that I no longer subscribe to a definition of international order that in fact builds the sovereign state into that conception. And I prefer a definition of international order that sees international orders simply as systemic configurations of political authority. And those configurations can take a whole manner of different forms. They can be imperial, they can be heteronymous, they can be sovereign, they can be some combination of those things. But that seems to get to the essence of what an international order is, but doesn't assume the existence of sovereignty in the definition. But I'll leave that aside for the moment. Now, my more substantive reason for disliking the distinction between pluralism and solidarism is that it ignores something that is fundamental about all international orders. All international orders are founded on the politics of recognition. In fact, in an important sense, we can characterize international orders in essence as recognition orders. There is something very fundamental about the decision about who constitutes a member or a recognized unit of political authority that is foundational to an international order, and it is foundational to all international orders. The politics of recognition, I would argue, has two common dimensions. The first is that international orders are founded on shared ideas, one, about who constitutes a legitimate unit of political authority, and second, how authority is distributed among those units. And that might be on some kind of equalitarian notion, as in the case of sovereignty, but it can also be quite hierarchical. The second is that now this has this question of the distribution of political authority has three important implications, I think. The first is that you can't get to a pluralist or solidarist order without going through the politics of recognition. It exists prior to the existence of anything that you might describe as a pluralist order. You have to have some agreement about who the members or the recognized units of authority are before you can talk about what kinds of norms are going to exist between them. So this is fundamental. The second thing is that the politics of recognition always involves socially thick understandings of legitimate agency. In my early work, I termed this the moral purpose of the state. And this is why we see in all international orders competition or contestation over the very nature of what constitutes a legitimate polity. That's hardwired into the nature of the order. And I would argue is actually, to come back to the discussion in the previous session, is actually central to the politics of inclusion and exclusion, is the definition of what or who constitutes a legitimate actor in an order understood as a systemic configuration of political authority. The third implication is that the politics of recognition always involves hierarchies, exclusions, and often violence. So this is, again, if you come back to the idea of a kind of pluralist international society or international order, I would argue, in fact, I actually think there are no historical exemplars of what scholars think pluralist international orders are. They have all been based on various forms of hierarchies and exclusions, often violent. Now, those who argue that this comes to one of the questions that was posed to the group. Often scholars cite pluralist international orders as though they are more peaceful or more stable than solidarist international orders. But that's only true if you bracket the exclusions that construct the pluralist club in the first place. So again, to come to Evelyn's point, a lot has to do with where you stand when you're looking at the construction of a purported pluralist international order. Now, the second dimension of the politics of recognition really comes to my more recent work on culture. International orders don't just distribute legitimate political authority, they also organize cultural diversity. Now, my argument in my recent work challenges the conventional view that international orders have emerged in culturally unified, to use the language of Martin White, contexts. In fact, historically, international orders have almost always emerged in heterogeneous cultural contexts. And because diverse meanings, practices, and identifications can be turned to all manners of political projects, the governance of difference is a key imperative of order building. Now, this involves, first of all, the authorization of particular axes of difference, but also the authorization of certain expressions of cultural difference and the delegitimation of others. Now, this has, in turn, just as with the distribution of political authority, has three important implications. First, the process of governing difference creates cultural hierarchies and exclusions. Second, these cultural inequalities are directly related to the political inequalities, in that the way in which cultural difference is organized is usually linked to how political authority is distributed. A classic example of this is the post-Versailles settlement, where we see that Europe reorganized on the principle of ethnic nationalism, but we see the maintenance of a Europe connected to a world based on civilizational hierarchies. So empire as a way of organizing political authority and the nation state within Europe as a way of organizing political authority are linked to particular ways of organizing cultural difference. Now, in this sense, and this is the third implication, in this very important sense, there is no such thing as a culturally pluralist international order. And a good example of this is the classic case of Westphalia, which is often cited as having solved the wars of religion by introducing the principle of sovereignty and therefore creating a pluralist international order. In fact, that was nothing of the sort. What we saw at Westphalia was a particular political cultural reordering of Europe, in what you see is a privileging of Christian religion, a particular set of Christian faiths. You see that delegitimation of other particular religious faiths, and you see the tying of these authorized forms of cultural difference to the new polities at the time. This is a classic example of what I'm talking about, the organization of cultural difference tied to the organization of political authority. So, second thing that I'd note here is that even when it seems that you have a pluralist international order at the level of the states, if you're talking about a state system, often that's been purchased as at the price of various forms of cultural homogenization within states. And you need to think about those things as paired, whereas IR scholars often bracket those things. Okay, now just to finish up my 10 minutes, let me think about a few conclusions about this. Well, the first one is my simple point that I think for thinking about the purposes of international orders, that distinction between pluralism and solidarism is decidedly unhelpful, partly because it's unsustainable theoretically and historically, but it was also because it directs our attention away from the different levels at which purposes work in the constitution of international orders. And I would suggest, to finish up, 3 different levels at which purposes are at work in international orders. The first is what I would call deep constitutional purposes, right? And this is what I've been talking about, are the purposes that are tied up with the authorization of particular forms of political authority and particular axes of cultural difference. The second is purposes that are, I would call architectural purposes. And these have to do with the nature of the institutional practices that emerge within international order on top of that constitutional structure below, or the particular kinds of institutional practices. And then finally, I would draw attention to functional purposes. And this is where things to do with, the management of violence, economic governance, etc., come into a particular international order. But I think, just to finish, we need to think about purposes at all those three different levels, and doing that without the shackles of this distinction between pluralism and solidarism will, I think, get us a long way. So I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Very, very, very enlightening. Thank you, Chris. Now I move to Jennifer Welch. Sorry for the Mac. Jennifer Welch. So she's, well, you know her, but I would just want to underline that she's one of those scholars that are so precious for our discipline, because she's the author of many books on human rights, R2P, responsibility to protect, but also, she's been the advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, looking at those purposes we're talking about from the ground. And she's actually preparing a book on sovereignty and responsibility. So this is very important to us now also. And Jennifer said she will be talking about the answers, what type of answers to the social goals, the proposed social goals of orders. And she will also, I don't know if it's still what you have in mind, Jennifer, bring up the issue of revolution, which I think hasn't been hardly mentioned in this day and a half of conference. And that takes us back to actually a book that Jennifer wrote a while ago about Edmund Burke and the international relations and the issue of French Revolution. But for me, it's quite obvious that, think of France in the 18th century, but of course, the Mao, Lenin, all of those people who were thinking of global revolution as order. But anyway, so it's a different take on this whole issue of pluralism and solidarism. The floor is yours, Jennifer, for 10 minutes again.
Great, thank you very much. And it's an absolute pleasure to be with this group. I've learned so much. And picking up from some of Chris's comments, I want to approach this last agenda item about the ends of order from historical and theoretical standpoints. And I want to draw from different parts of my work, including my earliest work on revolution, my writings on intervention, and my analysis of what we might think of as the liberal solidarist moment of the 1990s and 2000s, if not an order, a kind of moment. And I want to develop two main points. First, in discussing the ends of order, I want to stress that one of the key functions of international order is to demarcate the international and the domestic. There can't be order without an inside and an outside. And in this sense, revolutions which seek to blur those boundaries become very important, not just in the challenge they pose, given their universalist ambitions, by seeking to universalize domestic, or what John Vincent wonderfully called municipal, principles of legitimacy, but also in terms of the reactions that they invoke, which I would argue in many cases lead not to a return to some form of pluralism, but a different and more conservative form of solidarism. And second, I want to rescue pluralism and solidarism just a little bit, not to describe order so much, but in a more restricted sense, in delineating different versions of sovereignty and how they have been promoted and contested. So my reference point for thinking about order has always been shaped by the English school. And I think one of the interesting points about Hedley Bull's writings is that he suggested that there can be disagreement not just on whether a social arrangement or order is just, but also on whether it actually embodies order at all. So this suggestion of from whose perspective, I think is really important. But broadly speaking, and drawing on the last session, I think we see two goals or purposes of international order in the which initially apply to two different contexts, Europe and then Europe's relations with the non-European world. And these two visions came together in the post-1945 period, such that we have, as Eddie Keane has tried to argue, both purposes existing alongside one another rather awkwardly. So the first is that vision or end of order, which is to tolerate political difference and social difference among civilized people in order to foster cooperation, limit war, promote forms of peaceful coexistence, etc., which prevailed in the European core. And then the second end of order, to promote civilization of what was deemed to be a set of backward peoples, characterized not by the reciprocal recognition of sovereignty, but by the division of sovereignty and extensive forms of penetration. I don't want to elaborate on that because we talked about that in the last session, but it's interesting to me that the first end of order, that more seemingly pluralist one, has been described in various terms by scholars with a functionalist theme. International order provides stability of possession, minimization of forms of violence, predictability, in order to realize other types of gains. But what's too often overlooked here, I would argue, is one of the primary ends of this order, which is the consolidation of a particular political and social order domestically, or what we might even refer to as regime security. And what might appear to be a pluralist order begins to look slightly different when we consider that the sharing of those political and social principles across borders helps to reinforce and legitimize that domestic status quo. So deeper solidarity and homogeneity can sustain more pluralist principles of coexistence. So in my work, I've tried to show how revolutions help reveal this dynamic because they challenge prevailing principles of domestic legitimacy across borders. And we learn much from how other states react to that revolutionary challenge. So by studying revolutions, we come to see, contrary to the way in which solidarism is discussed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, solidarism can take on a distinctly conservative form. So for example, the legal and diplomatic order that developed in the early 19th century that we talked a lot about yesterday, a very important moment, was designed in important ways as a response to revolution. It was an effort to contain the effects of the French Revolution and to deny its vision of political and social order, to shore up dynastic principles of legitimacy. And I think there's ways in the Q&A we can talk about how homogeneity among liberal democratic states today, and by contrast, different principles of political and social order in non-liberal democratic states, how that dynamic is again, once again important. So secondly, rescuing pluralism and solidarism just a little bit. I think Duncan Bell's right that we need to interrogate the paradigms of academic scholarship in terms of what they are reifying. And I want to say a bit more about the problematic way in which pluralism and solidarism have been juxtaposed, building on some of Chris's comments. I think that when solidarism was revived as a way of understanding the liberal international order after the fall of communism, it seemed to me to create a caricature of the Cold War as a time of pluralism, or what Robert Jackson referred to as the era of negative sovereignty, external recognition and exclusive control over domestic jurisdiction. There are a lot of problems with this, empirically and theoretically. Empirically, and Chris has touched on this, post-colonial states were connecting sovereignty and self-determination to human rights explicitly in the post-45 period. And normative developments from as early as the 1970s were pushing back on more radical pluralist defenses of sovereign rights. But theoretically, I think it also has a couple of problems. First, by hinting that pluralist orders might be more stable, again, we have to ask for whom, from whose perspective. But secondly, pluralism positions itself in this understanding as being transcultural, transcending substantive values. But I wonder if this is really the case. Are the institutions of diplomacy, law, commerce that are depicted as part of a pluralist architecture purely pragmatic? Or do they represent important values among states and provide a framework for implementing them internationally? So yes, pluralism might be a defense against the forceful imposition of a principle of legitimacy, but it is still promoting a form of legitimacy. And my own view, which is inspired a bit by Chris's work, but also the work of Gary Simpson, is that theoretically, pluralist order is built on liberal principles: sovereign equality, non-intervention, state consent, multilateralism. These derive from liberal values. But interestingly, when we talk about the liberal international order today, we're not talking so much about those values. We're talking much more about, to go to the word somebody wanted us to use, cosmopolitan, human rights related values. But of course, these values of sovereign equality, non-intervention, state consent are firmly present in the UN Charter system. Lastly, Caroline, do I need to finish? Have I gone over 10 minutes? I can't hear you.
A couple of minutes would be,
Okay.
yeah.
Lastly, just let me say something quick about the liberal solidarist moment. Some would call the 1990s and the early 2000s as a more explicit attempt to build that second end of international order linked to progress and civilization into international law and institutions. So to make pluralist tools become more solidarist. Now, I've analyzed this alongside Rosemary Foote with respect to the responsibility to protect. And I think what this represents, to go back to something I said earlier, was an attempt to redefine what's in the domestic and what is international, because it focused on international crimes. And international crimes, by their very nature, are matters of international concern beyond the exclusive domestic jurisdiction of states. And it's fascinating to think that there are only 4 acts that have been internationally criminalized if we look at law: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. And they, in a sense, activate by their very nature international concern. And what I've tried to argue in my work, and this can come up in Q&A, is that this attempt to redefine the boundaries of the international and the domestic has been contested. And I think if we look at rhetoric and practice today, building on some of Stacey's methodologies, we can say that in many important respects, that attempt failed. That if we look at what the invocation of crimes now generates, it's not punishment, collective punishment or forceful action. It is only criticism. And once again, we've begun to describe violence within states, not in terms of exceptional criminal behavior, but as regular political violence within the domestic jurisdiction of states, and not a matter of international concern. So I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Jennifer. Very, very also stimulating paper. I'll now move to Matthias Spector, who is our voice from Latin America. And he's also, actually, I was talking about, the usefulness of scholars who are also doing other things. And he's also, I would say, a public intellectual in Brazil. So he talks both to academia and policy, but of course, academia, he's been written on a lot of issues about security, hard security, nuclear issues. But now I understand you will be talking about autocracy, and that has been, in and out, the elephant more or less visible in the room, and autocracy and liberal international order. So it's a very, very topical issue. Obviously, we all have it on our mind. And actually, already in the chat, I noticed that William Woolforth was already raising that. So I think there will be some debate about that. The floor is yours for 10 minutes as well. Thanks, Matthias.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, John Chikantoya, for the generous invite. It's been a real treat for me. So what I wanted to do today is tackle the issue of the ends of international order by looking at one of the critical questions that are now coming up in a big way, which is how will the United States and the liberal West deal with the third wave of autocratization? Of course, this is not the first time that the West confronts this question. The problem came up during the first wave of autocratization in the 1920s and 30s, and then it came up again during the second wave in the 1960s and the 1970s. And as you know now, the bulk of the conversation really is on illiberalism outside the West. It's all about China and Russia and the way they are promoting autocracy beyond their borders. But what's missing from this conversation, it's a side to the relationship between the West and global autocracy that gets some attention by professional historians, but gets almost no attention at all within IR. And it is this: as security competition among major powers intensifies, a liberal United States sometimes confronts a very powerful incentive to actually embolden and empower friendly autocrats and dictators and illiberal leaders within the US-led order. So this is a liberal hegemonic order where the liberal hegemon may, under certain conditions, support illiberalism among its partners. This, of course, happened during the 2 previous waves of autocratization in the 20th century, and I think it's plausible to expect something of the kind to re-emerge as we move into the third wave. So here's what I want to do. If we look back to US behavior during those previous 2 waves, we might actually derive important insight as to how we conceptualize how autocracy may fit within liberal order, what are the social and political ends of liberal internationalism, and what are the consequences of all these for liberal hegemony and for the wider world. So in the few minutes I have, what I wanted to do was go back to the past and treat US support for autocracy within liberal international order, not as a bug of liberal international order, not as the exception, but as a major component of what the US order was. And I'll do this by focusing in particular on the second wave of autocratization in the 1960s and 70s. So if we ask the question, what were the ordering principles that this particular arrangement had, through which a liberal hegemony drew friendly autocrats into its orbit? Here's how we might answer. Let's begin with membership. Membership in this subset of order was not confined geographically. It included countries from Southern Europe, think of Spain and Portugal, or Greece. It included Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. It was global, it was not regional. It was a very broad, inclusive church. The boundaries, however, were fairly clear. What this form of ordering tolerated, in particular, and protected, was the use of domestic political violence by these states against rebellious societies to prevent upheaval at home that might affect the global balance of power. And in the process, this created its own hierarchy and its own set of exclusionary principles and a great deal of violence. If we look at the functional scope of this particular international order, the purpose there was to protect right-wing dictators from domestic and external attack, given the role that they had in waging the global Cold War. But crucially, part of what this ordering does is protect friendly dictators from critics within the United States, because after all, this was a liberal hegemon all along. So it's about protecting these dictators from American civil society activists, from organized students in American campi, from members of the US Congress, and from dissenting voices within the executive branch in Washington. This subset of the liberal order was highly institutionalized. There were formal and legal specifications shaping the way the US dealt with these autocratic partners. And there was a great deal of emphasis on the part of US diplomats on very pluralist interpretations of international law and human rights law in particular. Sometimes there were official documents issued in public by the US government, like the Rockefeller Report of 1969, that lays out the principles as to why right-wing militaries make the best credible allies in the global Cold War, or more informal principles. Think of the Kirkpatrick Doctrine that President Reagan brings to office during his first term. Now, these autocracies were brought into the multilateral, liberal, US-led institutions in a big way. They all are brought into the GATT for free trade. They're all included in free-flowing investment norms, manage economic openness. They're all incentivized to develop very deep ties to the IMF and the World Bank before, of course, these institutions impose democratic conditionalities. And this illiberal side to liberal internationalism, if you want, had a clear-cut conception of modernity as well. At the time, the United States had a very clear preference for modernizing dictators, the so-called white revolutionaries. So someone like the Shah of Iran, for example, commanded far more sympathy in Washington than backward Salazar in Portugal or Franco in Spain. I think perhaps from an intellectual history standpoint, the single most relevant expression of this kind of thinking is Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, which was published in 1968 on the virtues of enlightened authoritarian rule in fast modernizing societies. The legitimizing principle here is the effectiveness of autocrats to bring these nations into modernity. is no longer a principle that was crucial in US support for autocrats in the first wave of autocratization in the 20s and 30s, which was racial hierarchy. By the time we get to the 60s and 70s, racial hierarchy is no longer the set of the universe of ideas that organizes support for these autocrats. Now, this subset of order within liberal international order is, of course, highly hierarchical in the sense that order was vertically organized according to unequal rights and authority. And yet, and this is crucial, I think, the distribution of power was far from centralized. There was a great deal of devolution to key countries. Think of Kissinger and Nixon and the Shah of Iran, or Suharto in Indonesia, or the secularists in Turkey, or the military junta here in Brazil, or the PRI in Mexico. There was an awful lot of autonomy and agency on the part of these dictators to actually manipulate their bilateral relationships with the United States to great effect for them. In terms of stability, I think this particular ordering had three sorts of foundations for its stability. First of all, the balance of power. So global security competition in a bipolar system pushed the United States to create a bounded order, which included a compact of democratic industrialized states, the democratic Western Europeans and Japan, and then a compact of autocratic states in the rest of the world that are friendly to the United States and that side with the United States in the Cold War. The second source of stability was command and control. The enforcement of hierarchy did not require an awful lot of coercion because the United States became, or ended up becoming, a sort of lifeline for the domestic political survival of sitting autocrats in these partnering states. And the third source of stability here was legitimacy. The rules and arrangements of this system did preserve national sovereignty. They granted subordinates a lot of autonomy. Autocratic states in the system were allowed to play a role and to have a voice. US leadership was often exercised not through the imposition of force, but through coalitions and compacts involving these autocrats. And of course, these autocrats took advantage of the fact that the United States was a liberal democracy and could manipulate the domestic US system to advantage. So these illiberal allies, if you want, lived in a liberal hegemonic order that was relatively open and accessible to them. Let me finish by saying a word about the sources of change in these particular ordering. My sense here is that what explains change is the balance of power. So the onset of the Cold War pushes the United States to support dictators. And by the time we come to the end of the Cold War, there's an opportunity for the United States to drop dictators. So the balance of power does a lot of the explaining. But of course, there's an element to do with ideas and domestic politics in the United States and transnational politics. So support for dictators begins to lose legitimacy in the wake of Vietnam, and in particular during the Church Committee in the US Congress in 1975. And of course, there's a major breakthrough around human rights in the 1970s. But I think it's important to retain this idea that although there's a lot of ideational transformation, in particular around human rights in the 1970s, when push comes to shove, this doesn't translate into the United States dropping dictators. Remember, Jimmy Carter comes in 1977 trying to do so. And by the time we get to 1979, he's reversed back to the old ways. When Reagan comes in, he brings Jean Kirkpatrick with him, celebrating dictatorship. It's not until the late 1980s that things really transform. So I reckon it's fair to say that support for autocracy abroad may well be a function of global security competition. And if it is, then maybe we are bound to see some of these stories play out again in coming years. But what's crucial in the story, I think, is that the fact that this is a hegemonic order led by a liberal hegemon makes all the difference, because successive administrations in the United States were forced to build norms and institutions to facilitate cooperation with these dictators, to protect these cooperation from enemies abroad, but also from enemies within the United States. So it's in this sense that I reckon that we would do well to revisit this past, how illiberalism fits within liberal international order. Thank you.
Very thought-provoking. Thank you very much, Matthias. And now moving, last but not least, Professor Miles Scaler, who has written on all sort of issues of international politics and international political economy, global governance, international financial institutions, Asia-Pacific regionalism, and he will be presenting the final presentation. Thank you. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, being the last speaker in an extraordinarily rich set of panels, I would be probably wise just to say everything has been said and cede the floor. But actually, what I'm going to say, I hope overlaps and reinforces some of the comments already made this morning and also yesterday. I want to align myself with particularly the remarks of Professor Bell and Fujiwara, as well as some of the speakers on my own panel. I want to talk about the fact that our conceptions of world order remain deeply state-centric, and there seems to be an implicit or explicit assumption that world orders are basically made and unmade by states and state elites. So first, I would argue that the conceptions of world order and the norms that infuse that order have been produced by actors other than state elites. That world order building includes many other actors than states, and this has been true for a very long time. It seems obvious in a way, but given our conversation over the past few days, I think it's worth restating and supporting that argument going up to the contemporary period. And this goes back, I would argue, the imagination of a world order, though hardly a universal order for reasons discussed in the last panel, dates to the period of the first global wars in the late 18th century and ending with Waterloo, accompanied by revolution and counter-revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the producers of these new conceptions of world order were typically outside the state. Order building was both contested and advanced by new actors. Imagination and promotion of new world orders was not a monopoly of state elites. New beliefs about the constituents and norms that should govern world order were contagious, as they would remain up to the present day, crossing state borders. And yesterday we discussed very briefly, touched upon the way that the norm of popular sovereignty spread to Latin America and the enslaved population of Haiti, where it was transformed into an anti-colonial and anti-slavery struggle. On the other side, and Jennifer Welch has already referred to this, the counter-revolution was supported by the norm of state preeminence, bolstering the traditional elites that staffed the state, even if it was dressed up in the new garb of a concert. It was a type of order, at least in its first manifestations, that was profoundly counter-revolutionary and intent on stamping out these new transnational norms. The promoters of the new norms in the 19th century where the new norms of the 19th century were often created and propagated outside of state elites, whether the laws of war or humanitarian intervention. Even though those norms could be certainly used strategically by state elites. And the transnational promotion of norms such as anti-slavery, women's suffrage, labor rights, were tied to normative and political opposition to the existing order, both domestic and international. And here I certainly want to reinforce the points that were made by Professor Welch in this regard. And that's the second argument I want to make, that world order since the era of the French Revolution has been directly tied to domestic order in at least two ways. World order expresses the norms that are rooted in a particular domestic political order, for example, hierarchy, as we've already discussed, based on class or race versus egalitarianism. And second, ideas of world order, ideologies of world order provide a means of mobilizing support or opposition to existing regimes. And that's what I want to concentrate, that second point. That mobilizing political support or opposition, these strategies were based on new conceptions and normative visions of both international and domestic order. The critical transition during the 19th century, I would argue, was the migration of nationalism from a radical doctrine which undermined the existing international order in the guise of popular sovereignty to an instrument that was equally useful in consolidating that order, confirming a new source of legitimacy for existing states and their rulers. The nation state was defined as a bundle of institutions, a relatively, I would argue, a quite new bundle of institutions, delimited boundaries, jurisdictional exclusion, administrative homogeneity, direct rule, an institutional envelope, but one that had to represent a people, which was eventually defined, of course, as a nation. The proponents of radical change domestically proposed alternative visions of world order, not founded on the operations of an aristocratic or military elite, but founded in the belief that political orders, domestic and international, should be grounded in the well-being of members of society, subject, of course, to all the exclusions that we discussed earlier today, and that such transformation required international change as well. Whether the liberals Cobden and Bright in the 19th century and their assault on aristocratic privilege and war-making, or the transnational anti-war socialism of the Second International, the fact that these challenges to existing order, whether liberal or socialist, were not realized in practice, indeed, in some sense, went down in flames in 1914, did not mean that they were without influence when they were wielded as weapons against the established order. And as state elites demanded more of their populations in blood and treasure during the era of industrial warfare, costly failures and ruptures in existing international orders were damaging to incumbent elites, and those who sought to maintain a hold on power or to gain power had to promise a different world order that was congruent with their domestic ideology and program, whether the liberal order of Wilson or the revolutionary order of Lenin. Now, this complex and politically contentious portrait of alternative visions of world order, and I really enjoyed hearing Professor Bell talk about alternative visions of world order, which I think have been left aside, the historical visions that were out there. But I would argue that this complex and politically contentious portrait of alternative visions of world order, infused with different normative content, seemed to fade after the First World War. The power of the nation state template on our imagination is, I would argue, an artifact of that moment in history, the middle decades of the 20th century, from roughly 1930 to 1975. This includes the autocratic waves that Professor Spector just referred to, when states asserted their power over societies in ways not previously imagined, and alternative conceptions of world order, at least in politics, seemed to fade away. Programs of order making outside the state did not disappear. We could obviously cite the influence of peace societies, for example, on normative change during the interwar period and the creation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which has been documented. But when order based on expanded state power produced another cataclysm, a truly global conflict in the form of World War II that killed 3% of the world population, the result was not a turning away from the state-centric system, but rather an effort to build a system to constrain states within a system that permitted them considerable autonomy. This was the Bretton Woods moment that John Eikenberry has described and others have as well, a world of nation states lightly regulated in their domestic politics and policy by formal international organizations in a closed global economy that only gradually reopened over the decades. And I would argue Bob Gilpin's book is actually a reflection of those decades, that particular set of decades when states were definitely preeminent in determining world order. The nation state template as a building block of world order triumphed again during decolonization. We've touched on that also, as movements that sought to build on transnational identities such as Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism failed in the face of post-colonial state elites that discovered anew the value to them of claims of nation statehood. Indeed, post-colonial states were among the most avid exponents of a state-centric order, reaching its apotheosis in the demands for a new international economic order in the 1970s. So if we look at the balance sheet of this state-centric world order in the Cold War decades after 1945, it was decidedly mixed, and we can all disagree and argue about what that balance sheet is. The collapse of empires and the transition to a system monopolized by nation states was one of considerable violence and loss of life. The rejection of economic integration in favor of state-led development often produced mediocre development outcomes. Meanwhile, within their borders, states continue to inflict harm on their populations with little response from the order maintainers among the great powers. And this is directly referring to Professor Spector's previous remarks, but we could go wider, whether it was the catastrophic Great Famine in China, Cambodia under Pol Pot, the suppression of the PKI in Indonesia, or the actions of the Pakistan army in the birth of Bangladesh, all of which received very little international attention or condemnation. The unchallenged hold of states on the normative content of world order, I would argue, weakened in the final decades of the 20th century, from roughly 1980 on. In the intellectual domain, even earlier, scholars in the industrialized world began to consider the implications of growing economic interdependence. And here, Bob Cohane, who's with us this morning, was a pioneer, as was Bob Giltman, but also dependency theorists in the global South, and others who investigated the economic inequality embedded in the existing order. New normative networks, order building exclusively by states, was challenged once again. These new normative networks emerged in the anti-nuclear, human rights, environmental area, and the agenda, pressed by non-state actors, widened considerably to include eventually global health, anti-corruption, and many other issues. Once again, old issues monopolized by states were pressed to reform and open to a wider array of actors, largely NGO networks, clearly largely centered in the global north, but linked to wider global networks as well. So the pre-1914 politics of order building was not recreated in the late 20th century, but in this era of globalization, two critical features of that earlier period reappeared. Alternative conceptions of order advanced outside the state, and a tightening of the link between domestic and international order. Where does this leave us in confronting contemporary world order? And let me close with this. First, the nation-state template, a foundation of world order since the 19th century, has since 1945 produced negative order, an avoidance of the worst outcomes of great power military conflict and economic collapse, but far less success in creating positive order in the form of equitable provision of global public goods. And we see that today, literally today, with the pandemic and vaccine nationalism. We have a proliferation of international organizations, but still great reluctance to delegate any authority to those institutions. And that's true at the regional level as well as the global level. The monopoly of the nation state template has itself created risks and costs. As aspiring state nations, this political envelope composed of multiple peoples, however defined, disintegrates in violence, as in the case of Yugoslavia, or faces resistance to state building, for example, the Forever War in Afghanistan. The problem is not failed states, but a failed template, poorly designed for some societies in its homogenizing and centralizing biases. And the absence of imagination, and here I go back to Professor Bell's comments, and imagination of alternative domestic orders by prominent actors in the international order is really the issue here that is at stake. Second, order making once again engages in an ever widening set of actors that are increasingly acknowledged by governments themselves, as in the Paris Agreement on climate change. The contagion of these ideas, for example, the remarkable spread of activism on racism across national boundaries last summer, continues even during a pandemic. The global normative agenda is increasingly set by these actors rather than states, whether multinationals pressing for protection of intellectual property, NGOs and the choice of which human rights should be promoted, or the advance of totally new norms such as R2P. And they are now, and this is a new development, I think, they are directly involved in governments, in relations of authority themselves through hybrid and other novel forms of global governance. So the question I leave is, will this far more complex political process that transcends national borders to shape global norms and governance from below create a greater collective ability to advance positive order? That's an open question, I think. The underperformance by the state-centric order does not mean that the alternative will be more effective. And finally, the link between domestic and international ordering is a challenge to the existing order. We've talked about it, but I just want to say we can call it the China question. Can the close link between global and domestic order be relaxed? Can a global order be designed that makes the world safe for both democracy and autocracy? Will both democratic publics and authoritarian elites regard such a world as unthreatening? Will the newly mobilized order builders outside the state be willing to accept a world order with diluted normative content, particularly in the areas of human rights and humanitarian intervention, in the interests of urgent collaboration on existential issues that were mentioned by Dan Dudney yesterday, such as nuclear weapons and climate, or issues such as international economic order, which generates self-interested cooperation? So once again, no answers, just questions, but maybe that's the best way to close.
Absolutely, terrific, very stimulating question. I also like the expression a world safe for democracy and authority, autocracy. That sounds very good. So what I suggest now is to open the floor to panelists as well as the audience. If we can do that, we have 25 minutes or so left, I guess. John, is that right? So, I mean, in order to, feed our conversation, because this is also one goal of this program, I guess, to have a conversation among us. I don't know what the us is, but to continue this discussion with the panelists. All the panelists would be good, but also to keep a little bit of time, if we can, for the audience, because I've spotted a number of colleagues, which I would love to hear as well. So let's start with the panelists. Can I suggest that you raise your hand and don't forget to erase your hand once the question has been asked. So do I see any raised? Well, I don't see any raised hands on the panelists. No question? Is there? Oh yeah, Jennifer
has her hand.
Okay, yeah, if you could use there's a little icon. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I use my old-fashioned handle.
That's fine. Okay.
I just wanted to comment on Miles Kaler's question about whether those who are promoting normative developments beyond states will have some success in their norm promotion, despite our current context. I think part of the answer to that may lie with the degree to which norms that are being promoted rely on state and intergovernmental structures for their realization. So when I made the comment that the attempt of the principle of responsibility to protect to reconfigure the boundary between what is international jurisdiction and what is domestic jurisdiction, and I said that it in large part failed, I want to clarify, because now I have more time, in which sense it failed. And if you look at one aspect of the responsibility to protect being the enforcement, the ultimate kind of solidarist defining feature, the collective enforcement or punishment of an infringement, that in our current system still requires, because the use of armed force is still something that is state-based if it's to be legitimate, the collective enforcement through armed force requires an interstate structure to agree on it. And therefore that is what has been difficult to realize. But if your particular norm or aspect of change does not require that, because it doesn't involve military enforcement or the use of armed force, then we might see different results. But I think in those instances where norms still require aspects of interstate architecture, that may be a way of thinking about where there'll be limitations and where there will be progress. I don't know if that's helpful for the question that you raised, which I thought was a great one.
Yeah, and indeed it brings us back to institutions. I mean, what Chris was talking about. There's one hand raised by William Wolforth. Go ahead.
Once again, just thanks for another incredible panel, so thought-provoking. I can't begin to figure out where to start, but I just couldn't resist responding to the question that Miles Kaler asked towards the end, which is thinking about a world order that would be potentially so safe for autocracy and democracy, and the degree to which the way we think about the liberal order is going to potentially create what might be just loosely called security dilemmas, but regime security dilemmas on both sides. And we now have this cyber-enabled subversion operations, which undermine the sovereign concept and create existential kinds of fears periodically within democracies. And you have apparently the reciprocal kinds of fears on the other side. And the question, my answer, I'm going to try to answer Miles's question by saying the answer is no, because if the liberal order is still based on liberal principles, the leading states within that order cannot credibly commit not to support a regime change within autocratic regimes under certain circumstances, in particularly if large democracy movements or movements for human rights emerge within those societies. No matter what we may say or commit to in our interstate relations with authoritarians, the credible commitment problem means that once something happens within one of these states, the normative, the legitimating, and even perhaps some of the material capabilities of liberal states will end up supporting a democratization within authoritarian states. And so that live and let live equilibrium seems to me to be very hard to actually make work.
Thank you very much. Now there's a question by Professor Barry Boozan and then Matthias Spector. I suggest maybe Barry Boozan first and then Matthias, yeah?
Okay, thanks. Well, I guess I need to rise to the challenge set by Chris about solidarism and pluralism. I don't quite get the drift of your argument there, in the sense I can agree absolutely that one wants to take states out as the necessary condition for thinking about international orders. No problem with that at all. And I don't have any problem with the argument that all orders are based on recognition, and therefore some kind of recognition process is in a sense a prior, or at least a starting point to orders, no matter who they're composed of. What I don't get is why the basic questions embodied in pluralism and solidarism, i.e., is the order essentially aiming for a principle of coexistence and a fairly minimalist order, or are there elements of cooperation and agreed values and therefore a thicker order? I don't see why those don't apply to any kind of international order that we might think about.
Okay, so I think, Chris, you have no choice despite the very late hour to respond, but maybe, do you want Matthias to speak first, or does it, how should we do that?
Chris, go ahead. I'll go afterwards. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so Barry, I think that the problem for me, I mean, it's clear that we agree on a lot, but the problem for me, first of all, is that once you accept that there's an underlying politics of recognition, then you're in fact talking about an order that is based, where the very notion of coexistence is based on an agreement about certain fundamentals about the nature of legitimate polities. And that's a thicker conception of the values that are needed to glue an order together than the standard way in which a pluralist order is conceived. So the pluralist order, it's the idea of the practical realization of pluralism actually requires a set of substantive identifications that actually that are not normally incorporated in the notion of a pluralist order. But also I think that it's important that what the pluralist orders that we've known historically have two characteristics that are not well captured in the existing literature. One is that the pluralist order, for example, of coexistence among sovereign states, most of the times where that's been manifest historically, that's been embedded with, and this is Eddie Keen's argument, that's been embedded within a larger structure of empires that are based not on norms of coexistence, but are based on norms of hierarchy and extended rule. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that if we look at attempts to create pluralism at the level of states, ever since what happened at the Treaty of Augsburg, and I'll call this in a sense, the Augsburg principle, is that after Augsburg, all attempts to establish pluralism at the level of states also involved certain norms about internal governance. So at Westphalia, it was about liberty of religious conscience. At Versailles, it's minorities treaties. After the Second World War, it's about norms about domestic cultural governance and human rights. So there seems to be a connection between the construction of something that looks like pluralism at the international level, but actually requires norms of domestic cultural governance. And that seems to be a common characteristic. So again, in all of these respects, the standard discussion about pluralism and solidarism, in fact, seems to collapse to me. So that distinction is unhelpful for capturing those dynamics.
Indeed. Thanks for this, Matthias. It's give you the floor, and then Andrew Phillips, and then Todia.
Thank you, Caroline. So Professor Walforth just brought up this rather crucial issue, right? It's the understanding that is very widespread that if the top dog is a liberal hegemon, then there's only so much it can do by way of supporting autocrats. When push comes to shove, in the last instance, there will be a time in which the liberal hegemon will have to confront the issue that some of its partners are autocratic, and regime change is likely to follow, or at least incentives for regime change, for democratization among allies. And to be sure, history suggests that's the case, but we can take a long time until we get to the last instance, right? And there are two examples today which to me are quite striking. The first one is the current conversation in the Biden administration as to what to do with the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. That's Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And what you find now is people within the Democratic Party saying, well, in exchange for these countries controlling the output of migrants, we might have to tolerate high levels of domestic political violence, turn a blind eye to a series of violations of basic human rights in those countries. And this becomes part of the public conversation. The other example I can think of now is the tenor of the conversation in Washington about the Philippines. Because the Philippines is now playing such a fundamental role in what happens in Southeast Asia, the number of voices in the US, which will now begin to say, well, maybe when it comes to Duterte, we need to accommodate. Even if Duterte very clearly has an autocratic project that he's been advancing to great success, then we're going to take it. So in the last instance, to be sure, but until we get there, we may end up rebuilding a sort of hierarchical ordering in which toleration for autocracy is not just an afterthought, but it's central to not only great power competition, the US and China in Southeast Asia, but also the US managing its own borders with Central America.
Very good. Andrew Phillips, you wanted to...
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say again how fascinating these panels have been. I'm really intrigued, though, in particular by Professor Spector's observations regarding the relationship between liberalism and counter-revolution support for autocracy. I mean, I found your account there quite compelling, and particularly in terms of the question about, well, the question that it raised for me was, well, the degree to which we can potentially code the liberal international order as being liberal international order if it is so dependent and has such a recurrent tendency to sponsor autocracies. And I thought, kind of pulling on that thread a little bit, the degree to which we might actually take some of that insight back into the 19th century, in that there's a conventional narrative of obviously first Britain and then the United States as successive liberal hegemons. But I think what's really interesting, if you look at the United Kingdom in that sort of period from the early 19th century onwards, the United Kingdom was heavily built a lot of its power on sponsoring and supporting, not through direct colonialism, but indirect rule in places, whether it be the princely states in India, or whether it be the trucial states in the Middle East, or even the post-Opium Wars cooperative policy seeking to rebuild the Qing dynasty. So I guess sort of the question I wanted to kind of throw out there is whether or not this is actually kind of something that is, that there's an innate two sides of the same coin linkage between liberalism and conservatism in the constitution of international order, and what that actually might raise in terms of the way that we tell the conventional story about the Anglo-American influence in shaping successive international orders.
Thanks a lot. I think there's, yeah, a question. Oh yeah, Tolia, yes.
Two questions, one for Chris and one for Jennifer. Chris, I really enjoyed your formulation of governance of difference being one of the purposes of order, international order. It's a very arresting formulation. And I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on that, because I think if we look at some of the traditional texts in IR, especially in the canon, there are similar formulations that are very familiar to all of us. International order, for example, is the governance of unequal power and accommodation to unequal power, or accommodation to conflicting interests. My sense is that you have a more kind of culturally textured conception of the governance of difference than either this kind of realist or functionalist conceptions. So I wonder if I could ask you to elaborate on specifically on the cultural dimension of your argument, and also suggest whether you have any ways of defending perhaps the causal primacy of that cultural component over the other ones, that there is significance, that there is utility to conceptualizing the governance of difference in cultural terms as a standalone category that is not reducible in any way to the governance of unequal power or the governance of conflicting interests in the standard accounts. And to Jennifer, Jennifer, I really enjoyed your argument about how the transition from pluralist orders to conservative solidarist orders is triggered by revolutions, that there is a kind of an accommodation to a possibility of revolution or the fact of revolution, and then the order changes in this almost a what Peter Gurevich called a second image reversed kind of accommodation. That's a very fascinating argument. I wonder whether this argument is limited specifically to forms of conservative solidarism, or if you'd be willing to extend that argument to solidarism writ large. And here I have in mind specifically this very peculiar punctuated chronology of international criminal law that unfolded over the course of the 20th century that we discussed before, where there are those three big moments, if you permit me to fold Kampala and the initial Rome negotiations into a single moment. We have the post-World War I moment, we have the post-World War II moment, and then we have that, let's call it post-Cold War moment that goes on for almost 2 decades. Can we think of those moments similarly in a kind of a second image reverse sense, with liberal states in effect accommodating themselves to threats to their own regimes? I mean, those moments are conventionally understood, of course, just in terms of a normative reaction to the dangers of a permissive jus ad bellum or a permissive jus in bello. I wonder if I can push you to extend your argument to cover these moments as well in second image reverse terms. Thank you.
So thanks, Tolia. What I suggest, because we're getting near the end, and maybe John might want to say a few words, as this is the end of the whole conference. So what I suggest, because these are richly textured questions, maybe a brief comment by Chris and then Jennifer, and then maybe John, you want to say some concluding words?
Sure. And Miles, I think maybe let each of our panelists say one last word.
Oh, okay. So let's do it that way. So each panelist in the same. So it would be Chris, Jennifer, Matthias, and mine, Skylar, all make a few comments, and then back to John. Back to you, John. Is that
Sure.
will work? So Chris, please.
Yeah, so Talia, great question. So a really simplistic way to think about this is that orders need to do two things in my mind. One is that they need to turn might into right? They need to translate unequal material capabilities into political authority. But the second thing they do, and this is the neglected thing, is that they need to govern diversity. Culturally heterogeneous environments need to be ordered, right? They need to be, in my argument, that's for 3 reasons. One is political control. The second is the kind of rational choice argument about coordination requiring common knowledge. And the third is political elites need to be able to locate themselves in a cultural landscape. And those two things, the kind of choreographing of difference and the translation of might into right, tend to go hand in hand. So we see authorized forms of difference being connected to the way in which political political authority is distributed. So I see those as two things that are both fundamental to and have been fundamental to all historical international orders. But it's the second dimension and its connection to the first, which is generally neglected.
Jennifer.
Great, thanks. Let me just make 2 points. Firstly, I think the direction of Andrew Phillips's thinking around whether we need to think about the relationship between conservative and liberal tendencies and how they coexist is interesting, because what I think I was trying to suggest and what Matthias is gesturing at is that and perhaps this is an analytical point we'd want to leave the discussion with, is the degree of confidence in more powerful states' domestic regime and their domestic and political order will affect the degree to which they tolerate alternatives to that, whether that be autocratic regimes, and how they also structure order. So there is a fundamental relationship between the degree of confidence they have in their own regime and system and elements of international order. So I'd like to kind of explore what you've raised, Andrew, over different points in time. With respect to Tolia's question, what I was trying to suggest is that we might want to take a subset or a branch of international law, and that is international criminal law, and think about its development as trying to answer this question of what is international jurisdiction and what is domestic jurisdiction. Because international crimes are so unusual and express this idea that matters are of international concern by their definition, right? And so your idea here, Tolia, that we might want to think about the punctuated moments as telling us something about the degree to which dominant states feel threatened by the implications of international criminal law is interesting. I don't have time to go into it. I think it requires more research and thought. But I would agree that this is a productive way of thinking about one aspect of order building. I just want to say one last quick thing, Caroline, is that I'm left from this conversation scratching my head about the degree to which we can think of order builders as a homogeneous category. I prefer to think about the task of order building, and I still struggle with the concept of an order builder because I think they can take different forms.
Definitely, the architects. So now, Matthias, there were a few comments that were addressed to you, but you can pick up whatever, yeah.
I'll just pick up one. Andrew Phillips raises this really important question. If the liberal hegemon, as part of global security competition, supports illiberal regimes, can we still call this a liberal international order? And I think John Eichenbree's done a brilliant job in his last book, in The World Safe for Democracy, to argue that no doubts, yes, this is a liberal international order. But what does that mean? It means that you can have coexistence between a compact of democratic states in Western Europe and Japan, and lots of other things within a system that is guided by largely liberal principles. So acknowledging that within liberal international order, there's support, conditional support for illiberalism, is not to accept neither the realist criticism or the sort of left constructivist criticism. The realist criticism, so John Mearsheimer will say, well, during the Cold War, this was not an international order, and it was not liberal. It was all about bounded orders geared towards security competition. And the sort of criticism from the left, and I think, you know, Noam Chomsky might be the best exemplary of this, is, well, American support for democracy and liberal norms was always hypocritical. The disconnect between word and deed has always been so enormous. There's no issue here. My point is, the interesting bit about looking at how the US supported illiberalism over time is that because it was a liberal hegemon, it had to couch that support and protect that support with an institutional scaffolding, not only to protect dictators from the Soviet Union or from domestic unrest, but also to protect US ties to those dictators from domestic opposition inside the United States.
Thank you so much. I can't see on. Yeah, Professor Callers, you have the last word, almost the last word.
Almost the last word. John will always have the last word.
No.
In everything, John. Very briefly, Professor Welch's comment, I accept your reframing in the sense that the norm promoters must engage states for certain types of issues if they want to realize their norms. I guess I would just qualify that by saying, once again, if we look back, the Second International had an instrument to prevent war, which they exercised, which was the general strike. And of course, it failed. We don't think about those sorts of instruments by other sorts of order builders these days, because once again, we assume states are in control of certain instruments and we have to use states or employ states or constrain states in certain ways to receive the outcome we want. And regarding Matthias Spector's points about autocracy, there are many, many reasons to support autocrats. And strategic competition is only one. There are economic reasons. In the case of the Middle East, for example, our treatment of MBS is clearly based a lot on, much more on economic interest. The politics in the United States within the hegemon have changed a lot since the second autocratic wave. And you can see that once again with MBS, the politics is very, very different than it would have been in, say, 1970, 19. It would have even been an issue that he assassinated a journalist. But most importantly, if I were a modernizing autocrat these days, I would look to China. There's no ideological reason any longer that in the second wave of autocracy, there were domestic reasons, counter-revolutionary reasons, these autocrats would not turn to the Soviet Union. Why not turn to China? In many ways, I would think China would be the obvious supporter of the modernizing autocrats these days. Thanks.
And I'll just, Caroline, thank you so much. And thank you for this panel. This has been fantastic. As interesting and stimulating as the other three. I've just been struck generally by this debate about what is international order, what does it do, how can we compare, how can we think about it across time and space, how can we theorize it. Actors go into the international space to do things that we call, as Jennifer said, order building for so many different purposes. I'm just struck by how that's so, and how these four panels have suggested that. International order is important to some as a structure for ensuring security, regulating violence. So that's one. There are others who go into the international order to build it, to regulate interdependence. And as several of you have said in this panel, and Miles made this a major point, it's creating an international order to reinforce polity principles at home, to make the world safe for X, Y, or Z. And that's the question of whether a world can be safe for X, Y, and Z at the same time. But it's about, it's the Gurevitchian, it's creating an international order that will then have feedback effects from international to domestic, to reinforce, to create a permissive environment so that domestic systems can operate as they want to. And then the fourth reason people go into the international order is search for social justice, which we kind of talk about at the edges really in these panels, but is another way in which people look to international order, struggle over international order for ends that they find important. So I think the only thing I'll conclude beyond that is we have more to talk about, and so I hope we can do it again. First of all, thank yous to Chika and to Tolia. You both have been fantastic. And Nikki, who has been our leader from behind the scenes at Peers, so we're very thankful to her. and to those who have helped with the technology, and to everybody here who have crossed so many different time zones, have either been just waking up or trying to stay awake because it's bedtime to be part of this conversation. Finally, next steps. This is the first of at least 3 annual conferences, and we'll have more to say about that in due course. And we hope that you all come back for another round, and we will frame things in a way that will allow us to move forward. So thank you so much. And I hope we can keep the conversation going. So appreciate it to every one of you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Chika. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Fantastic.
Thank you all.